So for people just to know, so welcome everyone. We are going to be recording the session, but just the first bit, we won't be recording the Q&A. And I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of Migration, Mobilities, Bristol and GRAMNet at Glasgow University to this, our third seminar in our seminar series, joint seminar series on migration and health. We've had two so far, really excellent presentations that I'm not sure if they're available yet, but the recordings will be available, so do take a look. There's some really interesting stuff that actually also kind of dovetails, I think, quite nicely with what we're going to hear about from Rebecca. So for those of you who don't know us, my name's Bridget Anderson and I'm the Director of Migration Mobilities Bristol, which is a specialist research institute at the University of Bristol. And we promote new thinking on people and movement. And one of the kind of themes that we keep returning to is thinking about when being a migrant matters, and when it kind of hides other things, whether we're talking about race or class or gender, that also matter. So when does migration matter, and when is it a distraction to focus only on immigration status? And I think Rebecca does really, really important work here, bringing together the disabled people's movements and insights from their struggles to the situations and struggles of migrants, refugees and asylum seekers more generally, recognising also that there are disabled migrants, refugees and asylum seekers. And she draws on, I think it's important to say, she draws on different knowledges. So she draws on kind of obviously her academic work, and at the moment she has a postdoctoral, ESRC postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Bristol, but she also draws on her knowledges as an activist and as a protagonist. So I'd like to welcome Rebecca and ask you to put your Q&As in the Q&A box, if you can remember to do that. It's easier to just look at one place, for me to look at one place. And then I might ask you, if there aren't too many questions, then I'll ask you to switch your camera on and your sound on. But if it looks like there's a lot, then I'll try and group them and put them as a kind of in batches to Rebecca. So without more ado, thank you for coming, everyone, and I will hand over to Rebecca.
Hi, and thank you. Yeah, so I've slightly changed my title to refer to the immigration system rather than just the asylum system, because particularly in the light of recent developments of immigration policy, it's clear that focusing exclusively on asylum is unhelpfully limited. So the images that I'm using are from murals. Oh, sorry, that's not working. Okay. So these images are from murals that are made up of messages from disabled asylum seekers in Britain. I've used art as a research method in a few projects, working with artist Andrew Bolton, and I'll use images from these murals to describe people's messages and experiences. But first, I want to talk about compassion. So in 2015, while she was Home Secretary, Theresa May proclaimed that we should let Britain stand up for the displaced, the persecuted and the oppressed, for the people who need our help and protection the most. And more recently, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak talked of his goals of balancing the pledge to stop the boats with assertions that the UK remains a safe haven for the most vulnerable. And yes, even Suella Braverman talks about supporting vulnerable people. And the UK-Rwanda partnership includes plans to resettle some of the most vulnerable refugees from Rwanda to the UK. So with such expressions of compassion, we might expect that at least the needs of disabled asylum seekers would be met. But that's far from the reality. So today I'm going to talk about the disabling impact of immigration controls, about some current government initiatives towards people considered worthy of compassion, and then I'm going to propose adapting and extending the social model of disability to help build solidarity and resistance. But there's no point in proposing things without acknowledging the barriers and thinking about how these might be addressed. Many elements of restrictions, immigration controls, have been gradually extended, particularly to the wider population of disabled people. So the purpose of my talk is to consider how we might build a broader, more effective movement of resistance for the benefit of us all. Immigration policy has always been designed to distinguish between people considered deserving and people who are not. Alongside the expressions of compassion, the hostile environment is explicitly designed to restrict people from meeting essential needs. And the impact of these restrictions and inequalities is actively disabling. And this impact is particularly stark for people who are already disabled, but the restrictions also create new impairments. So I'm going to give a few examples using messages and images contributed to the murals by disabled asylum seekers. I'm not going to be using people's names or giving their identities, because for some people it's safer to be anonymous. And these issues aren't actually unique to any individual. So this drawing shows a mother and a daughter looking at a house. Their asylum claim had been refused and they'd been made homeless. And the mother says, "This is not our house, we're just looking. We have no house to go to." These messages are combined with others in the mural to show a fence guarded by people with their fingers in their ears. On one side of the fence, people are struggling and reaching out for help. On the other side, there's a nice house with people sitting having tea. People in the asylum system can't choose where to live and have often left family and friends behind. Dealing with the loss of loved ones is particularly painful in isolation. So as this person recalled, "Only one person came to see me when I heard my brother's killed. I'm bleeding inside. I couldn't talk. I needed people to listen. I felt my insides going into a small hole. I needed a place to forget my pain." And he drew a picture of himself tending his brother's grave with the words, "Please hold my hand, don't hate me." And the next images show people's fear of the police in Britain. One person said, "If I see their bus, I'm always panicking. Even to pass a police station, I find it very difficult." And another talked of the police as having strong claws and said, "I say to police, you have strong government support, family. If you take me, who helps me? No one help, no family, no support." The deprivation, the fear and the violence of UK immigration controls are disabling. As one disabled asylum seeker explained, if they're torturing someone, they can't expect that person to be okay. And as others have mentioned in this seminar series, mental distress is so prevalent among asylum seekers as to be widely considered normal. Perhaps because it's seen as directly caused by the stress and deprivation of immigration and asylum controls, in my experience, there's less stigma associated with talking about mental distress than there is among the wider population. As one person put it, "This mental, it's been brought by the problems. I'm taking medication for mental. But if the things are better, I think all can be well." The restrictions of immigration controls reduce people's lives to struggles for immediate survival. Immigration policy can be understood as a form of what Mbembe refers to as necropolitics, or the power and capacity to dictate who may live and who may die. And this isn't abstract theory. As we all know, many people are dying as they seek to escape persecution and to build better lives. Inequalities in how people are valued and the opportunities that are available go beyond the formal immigration restrictions. As people in Bristol probably know, in recent years, Kamel Ahmed and Bijan Ebrahimi, both disabled refugees, were both murdered in Bristol after both repeatedly asking for police help. Kamel was involved in designing and painting the mural in 2012, and the mural last year was dedicated to him. In an official local authority report, failure to meet Kamel's needs was referred to as in part caused by unconscious bias. Now, whether people want to call it unconscious or so systematic as to be routine, the impact is the same. But I could carry on listing examples of horrendous injustice forever. As Peter Beresford argues, by telling the government, so some people seem to assume that by telling the government how much damage its policies are doing, it will magically stop imposing them. Or that if they show the public how bad things are, then something will have to change. But it's pointless to prove that the hostile environment is hostile. Now, it would be wrong to suggest that there is no acknowledgement of the needs for action. Along with expressions of compassion, there are several initiatives to reduce the impact of restrictions on selected individuals. These initiatives are not specifically directed at disabled people. In fact, the word disabled is very rarely used in the immigration system. Instead, current initiatives use euphemisms such as vulnerable, having exceptional needs, being at risk, or having care needs. These euphemisms frame the problem as if with a distinct and insignificant minority. But it's not new or unusual to refer to the damaging impact of these policies and practices. Theresa May commissioned the Shaw Report into the welfare in detention of vulnerable persons. And this was followed by regular reviews into the needs of people described as adults at risk. The Shaw Report notes that vulnerability is intrinsic to the very fact of detention. Similarly, the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration acknowledges that immigration control measures which deny access to services can increase vulnerability, with an emerging picture of negative outcomes linked to our system. But despite acknowledging the negative impact of immigration restrictions, the initiatives that exist focus on a never-ending quest to identify particular individuals without addressing the disabling impact of preventing people from meeting essential needs. As the Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration put it, Home Office efforts to identify vulnerable individuals is a test. It's a test of its competence, but also of its capacity for compassion. So expressions of compassion towards vulnerable individuals are used to improve, not to contest, the credibility of government policy. The restrictions of immigration policy are intentional. So references to compassion towards specific individuals are not designed to change that. Instead, alongside these initiatives, the restrictions and hostility of immigration policy have markedly increased. We need new methods of resistance. The use of euphemisms in the immigration sector, which avoid reference to disability, result in obscuring the relevance of the rights, achievements, and the potential for collaboration with the wider population of disabled people. But the disabled people's movement is highly experienced at identifying and seeking to resist the causes and impact of disabling oppression. So I argue that insights from the disabled people's movement, including key elements of the social model of disability, could help build resistance to the disabling impact of immigration policy. The social model of disability was developed by the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation and disabled sociologist Michael Oliver, among others. This shifted the focus from charitable approaches that present individuals as the problem, instead calling for collective responsibility to address the restrictions and inequalities that reduce opportunities and prevent people with impairments from accessing services. It's not new to argue that these issues go beyond the experiences of disabled people. As Colin Barnes argues, the politics of disablement is about challenging oppression in all its forms. Alison Tarrant from Cardiff University argues that the social model enables disabled people to see each other as members of the same struggle. It produces a new we, with demands that require action by society rather than individuals. Similarly, a social model approach to immigration could bring together the disabled people's movement, people subject to immigration controls, and allies of both to create a broader we based on solidarity and collective resistance to disabling restrictions and inequalities. Now, the social model of disability has been criticised for paying insufficient attention to the impact of impairments. But focusing resistance on socially constructed injustices isn't to suggest that this would remove all the emotional and physical pain that's inherent in many forms of impairment or in being forced to flee one's home. But it is to build solidarity and to focus resistance on what is changeable. Some elements of the social model are directly relevant to immigration. The social model of disability highlights that everyone has access needs, but that society is structured to meet some people's needs and deny others. Disability and anti-apartheid activist Vic Finkelstein famously wrote a story about a community built without steps, where wheelchair users can move about with freedom, but the ceilings are so low that walking people are disadvantaged. Similarly, the ways that society is organised also marginalised people without migration status. So this image of a hand saying, "Where is the interpreter?" and somebody in a cage was created by what represents a campaign by deaf people for interpreters. And this message is part of the mural that we did in response to COVID last year. So if interpreters aren't provided, people who don't speak English are similarly marginalised, whether or not they're also deaf. Now, not only does everyone have access needs, but everyone is also vulnerable if their needs aren't met. These three images of homelessness show someone on the left. There's a picture of the person who's happy and sociable when their needs were met, but when their asylum claim was refused, they became homeless. And the third image shows the same person looking vulnerable, crouched in some bushes between a police officer and a politician. So innate human vulnerability becomes apparent when people's needs are not met. As disabled activist and author Jenny Morris put it, we should be campaigning to remove the policies and practices which create vulnerability, not using the term as a qualification for support. But as I said, it's meaningless to assert the need for a social model approach without acknowledging the barriers. The ultimate sign of success is perhaps when an idea becomes hegemonic, or so widespread as to appear common sense. Reference to the social model of disability became routine. In fact, Michael Oliver described how the big charities spoke of the social model as if they'd invented it. But like many, perhaps all progressive ideas, the version of the social model that became hegemonic was co-opted and distorted. It's been widely reduced to the goal of removing barriers so that disabled people can be economically productive. In relation to immigration, attempts to build systemic change are routinely diverted by attempts to identify individuals worthy of compassion and to vilify others. Now, the social model of disability was developed by disabled people in response to lived experiences. But when people are struggling for immediate survival, there's little capacity to lead resistance. As Manjeet Kaur explained just months before she died, in the face of immediate struggles as a disabled asylum seeker, I don't have the energy. I myself am in a floating boat. I can any time fall down. The mantra of the disabled people's movement, nothing about us without us, is as valid as ever. But when people are struggling for survival, the solidarity of allies is essential. The question then is, who are the allies? This really shouldn't need saying, but the Home Office exists to implement government policy. Now, I know the government currently likes to talk about activist civil servants, but Home Office initiatives towards vulnerable people are not and will never be designed to challenge government policy. Restricted access to services and support is a central tool of government immigration policy. But it's easy to vilify the Home Office and its contractors, and barriers to change are not exclusively at this level. The immigration voluntary sector is made up of organisations with many different purposes, including providing services, campaigning, and peer support. These organisations may have greater potential to challenge immigration policy. Many of these organisations carry out critically important work, often saving lives by supporting people to meet essential needs. Government immigration policy is often criticised. But few organisations focus attention on learning from or building horizontal solidarity with other marginalised people, including the disabled people's movement. This risks undermining work. Sometimes this is simply a missed opportunity, but other times it risks undermining wider campaigns. For example, collaborating with local authorities' approach to social care without seeking to understand or to collaborate with campaigns led by disabled people's organisations risks undermining work to uphold the rights to independent living as enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. More generally, reinforcing Home Office use of individualistic charitable approaches to disability, which rely on euphemistic references such as vulnerability or being at risk, have regressive impact on the achievements of the disabled people's movement. And collective response is further hampered by lack of public concern. The marginalisation of disabled and migrant populations means that wider public understanding is shaped not so much by direct relationships, but by representations in the media, including social media. In 2016, a UN investigation criticised government officials for making unsubstantiated accusations about disabled people that encourage negative media reports about negative media reports and public hostility. Recent tweets from the Minister for Disabled People wearing a bulletproof vest, supposedly to address fraud, or him complaining about small boats, shows that this has only got worse. And current response to COVID is just the latest example of how far we've come from the collective responsibility to remove disabling barriers that is advocated by a social model approach. According to the Office of National Statistics, 60% of people who've died from COVID are disabled. Yet instead of collective public action, COVID precautions have been largely removed, with the responsibility left with individuals considered to be most at risk. This image from our mural last year shows a wilting bunch of flowers on a windowsill. Events that have returned to being in-person only with no COVID precautions result in the exclusion of hundreds of thousands of people who cannot leave their homes, including people whose lives depend on avoiding infection. This response highlights how publicly acceptable it's become to treat disabled people's lives as disposable. Now, it's common for people to suggest that the first step in addressing the injustices faced by disabled asylum seekers is to get accurate statistics on the number of people. But not only is this an impossible task and a distraction from the disabling impact of immigration restrictions, but the example of the response to COVID highlights that asserting numbers of people is pointless if those people's lives are not valued. So to summarise, we can't end disabling injustices by proving that the hostile environment is hostile, or by identifying exceptions who are considered worthy of compassion, or by counting people or ignoring the barriers. But if current inequalities are socially constructed, then the issue is not whether change is possible, but how it can be achieved. So what can be done? The injustices experienced by disabled asylum seekers could become the impetus to recognise the disabling impact of current policies, to acknowledge and address the barriers, and to build a broad-based movement of solidarity that learns from people with lived experience of injustice and works collaboratively to demand a society in which support is provided on the basis of need and common humanity. And in case you think that goal is too ambitious, as Ellen Clifford writes in her brilliant book, The War on Disabled People, we have no choice. The stakes have become too high. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks for some of also really fantastic images as well, really beautiful. Can I ask people to put any questions in the Q&A? And while you're thinking about your questions, I've got a couple I'd like to put to you, Rebecca, if that's okay. So I suppose I've got two. I mean, I've got lots, but two immediately come to mind. One is, I wondered if you could tell us something about, give us an example where this of a kind of achievement of the social model, and what sort of changes in practice has the social model led to that can help inspire the migrant sector. And kind of relatedly, so you talked about kind of the migration sector generally not kind of reaching out to disabled people's movement, which I mean, I certainly think from an academic point of view, that's also really true. I mean, there's been very little work, I think, academically, very little research done bringing those two perspectives together. But has the disabled people's movement reached out to the migrant and asylum sector? Like, and if so, how has that worked? So that was kind of one set of questions. And then the other is something that I know that both of us are interested in, and you kind of briefly touched on it, because it is the idea of the worker citizen, because it seems to me that that's something that really oppresses everyone, migrant and non-migrant, and benefit claimant and disabled person. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the worker citizen and the possibility of finding some kind of coalescing of interests around that.
Yeah, thank you. So the social model, the social model shifted attention from disability being seen as an individual medical problem, where people either needed to be changed medically or that people were worthy of some charitable support, and instead focuses on the disabling impact of not providing for people's needs, not providing services and support. So that is a way of building a movement rather than it being a whole set of individual struggles. So the social model brings people together. And I'd also say that when the disability movement is working well, the methods of organising are actually innately revolutionary, because it's part of organising to make sure that people's access needs are met. So it's very routine in disability meetings to have people who are widely ignored, whose needs are widely ignored, and to structure the meeting so that everybody can be contributing, and so people's voices are heard who are not normally considered. So I think that in itself is, like I say, I think it's innately revolutionary. And I think to bring that together with campaigning on the immigration, in the immigration sector, could bring together, make it more routine to ensure that people's language barriers are addressed, as well as different access needs that people have. So yeah, in terms of what whether the disabled people's movement has reached out to the immigration sector, no, not enough. That's completely true. But I'd also say that the oppression of disabled people has also only got worse, and that many people are struggling with immediate needs as well, whether or not they're also asylum seekers. So, which is why I'm saying that we need to be working together as allies. And although, so another thing about the social model, that sort of basic thing of nothing about us without us, is absolutely fundamental, but that we can't expect asylum seekers to be leading alone, or disabled citizens to be taking the lead, but that it needs to be a big movement. There's no way that any of these specific marginalized people can actually be leading it without massive solidarity. The right to work, yeah. So yeah, this is another example of the voluntary immigration sector campaigns that I just find really difficult. So campaigns for the right to work in the immigration sector are often framed as if it's common sense. And of course, it is essential for people who've had all their support cut off when their asylum claim is refused and they're not even allowed to work legally. To have the right, well, without the right to work, it means that if people do any paid work, their risk of being detained and deported is even greater. But these sort of campaigns seem to ignore, when people talk about it as if it's common sense, it ignores the fact that disabled people have the right to work, and it's not a right, it's turned into an obligation to find paid work. And that's only getting worse. The recent Health and Disability White Paper makes that even more coercive. And so that very campaign about framing it as common sense for asylum seekers to have the right to work is actually undermining of a wide disabled people's campaign for people not to be forced into finding paid work. And I think it's really naive of anybody to think that if asylum seekers had the right to work, it wouldn't be accompanied by similar oppressive conditions as are imposed on other people in Britain as part of the conditions that mean that people have their support cut off unless they find paid work, whatever the barriers are to finding that paid work, or however unsuitable that work is. And the reality is that many people have died because of this. Many people's support has been entirely cut off and lives have been lost. So I just think that campaign for the right to work it's really problematic, and yeah, it's a good example of where the asylum, the voluntary asylum sector and the disability movement need to come together to actually get some more productive, collaborative campaigns.